and forces beyond humanity's understanding, a vast, uncanny, and incomprehensible dimension that can be entered through dreams. The Dream Cycle is a series of short stories and novellas by Lovecraft, one of the most notable of which is The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, illustrating the scope and wonder of humankind's ability to dream. Everyone has their own dreamland, but share a common general land of vision. Lovecraft's stories are so bizarre that the average reader is stripped of all their preconceptions about reality, and even their sense of self. In the stories, the characters who fear the loss of individuality and attempt to preserve it are the ones who fall into madness. The concept of otherness, of the quality of being different, is important to be integrated. The self and the other are to be simultaneously accepted. In the story, Through the Gate of the Silver Key, the protagonist, Randolph Carter, holds the mysterious silver key and opens the ultimate gate. There he sees his past and future selves, yet he also begins to see Carters in every known and suspected age of Earth's history. These Carters are all equally himself. He even notes how each small decision alters who each of those Carters become in their own timelines. This omniscient awareness gives way to a loss of individuality. One learns that one is no longer a definite being, distinguished from other beings. Therefore, the other becomes just as worthy of acceptance and consideration as oneself. French philosopher Gilles Deleuze describes this as a transformation from paranoia to schizomadness, concepts which are used as philosophical metaphors describing perceptions of one's identity. Those with paranoia have an urge to align everything with their identity and disregard otherness. On the other hand, schizomadness refers to an integration of the unconscious, accepting other identities, beings, and one's simultaneous place among them. This is also reminiscent of Carl Jung's approach of individuation, where one integrates one's unconscious contents in order to advance towards the self. One must accept the loss of individuality by acknowledging that one is not the master of one's own house, but this is usually met with paranoid resistance. Through the reading of Lovecraft, the reader goes through their own anti-human becoming. A window into otherness unveils the monster as none other than oneself, and the horror to change this is the only monster we are meant to conquer. In The Outsider, Lovecraft tells the tale of a man who lives in solitude in a decaying dark castle and can't recall when or if he ever saw a living person. He decides to climb the tower into the unknown outer sky, since it was better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever seeing the light of day. He enters a window and is met with people whose faces were hideously distorted with fear, fleeing with horrible screams. The man trembles at the thought of what might be lurking near him, unseen. He then sees a reflection. I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can support the channel on Patreon or by liking, commenting or sharing the content. Thank you for watching. To honor and accept one's own shadow is a profound spiritual discipline. It is whole-making and thus holy, and the most important experience of a lifetime. Robert A. Johnson was an American author and Jungian analyst, a follower of Carl Jung's analytical psychology. At the age of 11, he had a near-death experience in a car crash and was rushed to the hospital. He found that the nothingness, the blackness, was also the ecstatic world. He saw the world golden in visions. When they saved his life and the vision stopped, he could not bear to live. In therapy, he was convinced to live because without the human faculty, he could not see the things which he treasured so much. Robert had a great difficulty with the outer world.
At one point he was known as Parsifal, an innocent fool. He experienced many slender threads between life and death during his life. Exploring the inner world helped him tremendously. His encounter with Jung was decisive. He wrote, "Dr. Jung told me to spend most of my time alone, have a separate room in the house to be used for nothing but inner work, never to join any organization or collectivity. Dr. Jung told me that the unconscious would protect me, give me everything that I needed for my life, and that my one duty was to do my inner work. All else would follow from this. He said it was not the least important whether I accomplished anything outwardly in this life, since my one task was to contribute to the evolution of the collective unconscious." At the age of 54, and feeling lost in his life, Robert visited India alone. After a long and exhausting trip, and having lost his luggage, he went to his hotel and wanted nothing else than to sleep the whole day. He looked outside the window and was struck by the beauty of the sight. He experienced the golden world a second time, after many decades. He was given a second chance. If you trust the inner world, it will take care of you. The golden world is there all the time. It is a misconception to think that we produce it or earn it. It is not some other place or time, but a state of consciousness, an experience open to anyone, at any time and at any place. The kingdom of God is within. Robert has published books such as He, Understanding Masculine Psychology, She, Understanding Feminine Psychology, and Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche, among others. We will be focusing on the third one. In our times, the water of life lies not in the external world, but rather within. The exploration of our inner world is the most important task in our lives. For this, one must go beyond the ego, what we are and know consciously, and delve into the shadow. Robert refers to Jung's early usage of the term, the part of us we fail to see or know, anything that is part of the unconscious. There are many misconceptions regarding the concept of shadow. It is commonly seen as evil, dark, and something to be avoided. However, this is not the case. The shadow is not a detached thing that is not part of oneself, or the embodiment of the devil. It is a part of you. It cannot and should not be avoided, for you will be going against yourself. We all have a shadow walking behind us, both literally and metaphorically. It is the mirror image of ourselves that we cannot see. It represents those aspects that we lack. It has a compensatory role that seeks to restore a wholeness of personality. For instance, the shadow of a criminal would not have murderous impulses, but the opposite: sincerity, relatedness, tenderness, etc. The shadow of a shy person would be assertiveness, commitment, responsibility, etc. By displaying only the pleasant parts and highlights of oneself, and by denying one's emotions and inner feelings, because one wants to, for example, be likable or avoid conflict, one will build resentment that will go directly to the shadow and be projected onto others unconsciously. We must recognize that we are capable of both good and evil. That is the only reality. To deny darkness is to deny half of oneself. With this in mind, most of us strive for a life of goodness, tranquility, and happiness. The shadow is not to be seen as our enemy, but our friend. It contains pure gold, waiting to be integrated into our personality. The shadow only becomes hostile when it is ignored or misunderstood. That is when it takes control of us, because we are not willing to. You can either be led and guided in life by your shadow, or be dragged through life by it, leading to neurotic behavior. It is not good that makes holy, it is the union of both good and evil that gives way to the transcendent. So, how does the shadow originate? Our refused and unacceptable characteristics do not go away. They only collect in the dark corners of our personality. When they have been hidden long enough, they take a life of their own, the shadow life. If it accumulates more energy than our ego, it erupts as an overpowering rage. Someone once told Jung, "How do you find your shadow?" He replied, "How do you find the dragon that has swallowed you. By definition, the shadow is a part of you that you don't know. You don't talk about your own shadow. If you can talk about it, it is already conscious and no longer shadow. As such, other people are more likely to see your shadow first, an embarrassing reality. We are all born whole, but somehow culture demands that we live out only part of our nature and refuse other parts of ourselves. We divide the self into an ego and a shadow because our culture insists that we behave in a particular manner. This is our legacy from having eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, gaining consciousness of good and evil. The shadow can also be seen as sin, and the self as the figure of Christ. Culture is the great leveling process. It brings everyone down to the same level. This means that also some of the pure gold of our personality goes into the shadow. Robert writes, "Curiously, people resist the noble aspects of their shadow more strenuously than they hide the dark sides. To draw the skeleton out of the closet is relatively easy, but to own the gold in the shadow is terrifying. It is more disrupting to find that you have a profound nobility of character than to find out you are a bum." Ignoring the shadow is to ignore the inner gold, and many only discover their gold when they suffer from severe or life-threatening illness. This intense experience shows us that an important part of us is lying dormant. The archetype of the wounded healer is one who has learned to cure himself and find the gold in his experience. This is typically the role of the shaman who often falls ill, only to gain the insight needed to heal himself and bring wisdom to his people, the elixir of life. As we reach adulthood, we have a clearly defined ego and shadow, a system of right and wrong. The religious task is to restore the wholeness of personality. Religion means to put things back together again, to connect whatever is fractured. This is the job of the religious life. We modern people are broken within. The truth is hard to bear, and we do not want to hear that there's something in the world more important than our ego. Something needs to die. Not our bodies, but the ego. Robert writes, "Generally, the first half of life is devoted to the cultural process, gaining one's skills, raising a family, disciplining oneself in 100